Hi, I'm Martin Smith. I'm just trying to get the timing right for a conference talk that I'm doing this afternoon. So I thought I would record it in case anybody else is interested in my research. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Martin Smith. I teach creative writing and I'm doing a PhD research in storytelling practice for immersive media. But this talk today is building on a little rumination that started at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. Like people in any profession, academics working in the higher education sector had to adjust quite suddenly to the pandemic in March last year. One specific and arguably understudied area of academia that was affected was the academic conference, defined by Budd et al. As a traditional platform for researchers and professionals to network and learn about recent developments and trends in particular academic field. As a result of the current situation, conference organisers found and continue to find themselves forced to pivot to online conferences with remote attendance and participation. But while the current situation necessitated a sudden sector-wide shift, online conferences were a growing trend even prior to the pandemic. With this talk today, I'm going to investigate the shift to virtual conferences and the potential problems and opportunities that this presents. In order to do this, I'll start by trying to answer the question, what are conferences for? First, through a brief reflection on my own experiences at conferences before relating these experiences to recurring answers to these questions in relevant literature. Having explored what purposes conferences can serve, I'll then outline some of the potential advantages and disadvantages of virtual conferences in comparison to traditional face-to-face conferences, before ending by exploring the potential for online technology to give rise to a more drastic reconceptualization of the academic conference than seems to have been the case so far during the pandemic. During the first year of my PhD, I presented aspects of my research at 3 conferences, which attracted different types of audiences and speakers, but all shared a very similar structure that I'm sure will sound very familiar to many of you. Panels of 3 or 4 talks, questions from the audience, either at the end of each talk or at the end of a full panel of talks, more informal periods of activity and conversation, like poster presentations and tech demos, and longer keynote presentations. Of the 3 conferences, only one involved any remote participation from one speaker who had visa issues and so did the presentation via Skype on a little laptop put on a table at the front. It felt clear that there wasn't a contingency plan for this going into the day because remote participation wasn't standard practice at many conferences. These conferences served as milestones of progress for my PhD project and important experiences in terms of my own professional development. They forced me to articulate my research to a variety of audiences, allowed me to build professional relationships that have resulted in lasting collaborations, and challenged my ideas and reasoning through audience questions and informal conversations, making my project a lot more robust. However, these positive experiences came at some expense, both financially and in terms of time. Participation required travel to the venue, overnight accommodation for at least 1 night, subsistence costs, and 2 of the 3 conferences charged attendance fees. Even with some of these costs reimbursed, each conference carried a financial cost to me personally, and it would not have been possible to get the same partial reimbursement had I just been attending the conference rather than presenting, which would have prevented me from attending. The conferences were also disruptive to my caring responsibilities for my young daughters, requiring time away from home in order to participate, placing an unfair burden on my wife for the time that I was away. So, in this reflection on my own experiences of academic conferences, there are echoes of the recurring arguments made in the literature on academic conferences that explore questions such as what a conference is for and why do we conference? Important questions to consider here in order to later address the relative advantages and disadvantages of particular types of academic conference. Gaikora et al. Described the key benefits of conference attendance for the individual academic as learning opportunities, sharing of ideas, and networking. Other literature on the subject also emphasizes both the possibility of learning about the subject and the opportunities for networking and collaboration that can take place at conferences. For example, Broadfoot et al. Use a survey of conference participants asking why do scholars conference to suggest the main reasons academics attend conferences are to keep up with recent research, meet and socialize with colleagues and friends, and improve their academic record. Similarly, Erickson et al. Argue that conferences are important because they bring people together to share, discuss, and develop knowledge, and they enable participants to interact with one another, offering the possibility of forming new relationships and strengthening existing ones. One way of conceptualizing these overlapping statements is that academic conferences allow communities of practice to develop. As academics convene in a shared domain of interest to interact and learn together around a shared practice. If it is the case that one of the primary benefits of a conference is to facilitate a community of practice, why did the face-to-face model of conferencing remain prevalent until the current pandemic? What might the advantages be of this model of conference, and to what extent might these aspects also be true of virtual conferences? In describing some of the advantages of face-to-face conferences over their virtual equivalent, Sa et al. Argue that attendance at physical conferences can give rise to a feeling of belonging to a community with common interests. Many of the interactions between lecturers occur in the corridors, in coffee breaks, or in the social side of events. Others have made similar points about the importance of the more informal, sometimes chance interactions at physical conferences being crucial to the experience. The often repeated assertion that participants in online conferences feel less connected than those at physical conferences is sometimes, but not always, accompanied by specific examples that would seem to support that claim at first glance. For example, while writing about a conference held in the 3D virtual environment Second Life, Erickson et al. State that one of the major drawbacks of the conference compared to the face-to-face equivalent is that there was a scarcity of opportunities for unstructured social interactions that create and reinforce social ties. However, Kaimura and Ho offer quantitative evidence for consistently strong participation and feeling of belonging to a community over a 5-year period at a particular teaching conference. Indeed, Sempia has written about the same Second Life conference as the one that I mentioned before, from the perspective of issues with the event's design, suggesting that some of the problems with lack of social interaction may have been caused by the architecture of the social environment, the virtual environment, and the similar appearances of the participants' avatars. From this, it may be possible to conclude that careful design of online conferences can alleviate some of the perceived loss of meaningful social interaction. Of all the questions I've researched around virtual conferencing, it's been by far the easiest to find writers listing the disadvantages of the traditional face-to-face conference, or the legacy conference, as I've seen it described, which is obviously a loaded phrase implying a model of conferencing that maybe belongs in the past. The most common criticism is the environmental impact caused by travel to physical conferences, specifically the carbon emissions. Conversely, the reduced carbon footprint is an obvious and often mentioned advantage of virtual conferences, with McDonald describing the desire to reduce carbon emissions caused by flying as the initial impetus of the growing number of online conferences prior to the current pandemic. Hybrid models, mixing virtual elements with regional physical events, such as the hub and node models described by Fraser et al. In 2017, where conferences are connected by regional face-to-face hubs, can cut down on international travel and reduce a conference's carbon footprint while maintaining some face-to-face interaction. Other disadvantages of physical conferences include accessibility issues, the traveling cost leading to a potential lack of inclusivity and diversity, and the arguably flawed models of learning that are built into the design of many conferences. Viglione has noted of the current situation, many of the adjustments that conferences are making, such as introducing virtual participation, are accommodations for which disability activists have been clamoring for years. This applies both to the navigation of sometimes inaccessible physical spaces and the travel to conferences, which is also a potential barrier to participation for those from particular parts of the world who may have visa issues, and people with caring responsibilities who cannot be away from home for multi-day conferences and time-consuming travel. It is these sorts of, quote, restrictive structures and constrictive processes that Broadfoot et al. Argue act as exclusionary mechanisms to reduce diversity in conferencing content, practices, presences, and voices. Broadfoot et al. Also raised the issue of the learning structures evident at many conferences, stating that conference activities involve too much one-way communication and arguing for rhizomatic conferences with learning happening from one participant to any other. Raven and Ellsberg make a similar point, criticizing what they call the transfer model evident at many conferences, in which, quote, learning has taken place when information from the active sender, as encoded in the message, has been absorbed by the passive receiver. And stating that while there has been extensive experimentation, practically everywhere else in the educational world, that is not the case for conferences. As I've already mentioned, one of the key advantages of virtual conferences and main factors pushing experimentation with new models of conferencing, putting aside the current pandemic and the need for social distancing and reduced travel, is the reduced environmental impact of virtual conferencing. However, this is not the only aspect of virtual conferences that might be preferable. Superficially, it would seem the advantages and disadvantages of virtual conferences are the inverse of those found in face-to-face conferences. But a deeper analysis demonstrates that the situation is probably not that straightforward. For example, while an entirely virtual online conference removes some of the barriers to participation of face-to-face conferences, the format potentially erects new barriers to participation, such as digital literacy and the uneven geographical distribution of high-speed internet. There is also some disagreement from those with experience of organising online conferences on some of the potential advantages. For example, Aka Kulvizit et al. Write of their experience organising a virtual conference, suggesting it was much more straightforward than organising a physical conference, as there is no location to organise, no rooms to book, no projectors, no caterers, entertainment, travel, or hotel reservations to worry about. But conversely, Gaikara et al. Suggest allowing 6 to 9 months before the date of a synchronous online conference for scheduling an organisation, as they found the challenges posed by virtual conferences with participants in different time zones to be uniquely complex and time-consuming. While there are some differences in their experiences of organising online conferences, Gaikara et al. And Aka Kulvizit et al. Both suggest that an advantage of the online conference is its potential to have more impact by attracting higher profile speakers who would need to invest less time into travelling to the conference and so may be more open to contributing. In contrast to the recurring argument explored above that face-to-face conferences allow for more meaningful informal interactions between participants, it's also been suggested that virtual conferences might be less socially intimidating for some people. There's also a number of potential disadvantages of virtual conferences, aside from the ones that I've touched on just there. Technological problems are initially mentioned in almost all the literature that I have reviewed that recount experiences of organising online conferences. Another common issue seems to be the complications caused by time zone differences, which is mentioned in a number of articles recounting experiences of organising online conferences. MacDonald also makes the point that a switch to online conferences could financially impact many research networks who might be relying to some extent on conference revenue and may find it hard to convince people to pay full conference fees for a remote experience. So here I come to the problem that I don't claim to solve today with this talk, but that I'd like to leave with people to think about. While it is not necessarily a disadvantage of virtual conferences as a concept, an observation of most of the examples of virtual conferences in the literature reviewed so far in this little detour in my research is that they are all, to some extent at least, transferring the existing structures of the traditional face-to-face conference wholesale onto an online platform. So Sa et al. Argue that virtual conferences encourage much more unidirectional spoken or written information than bidirectional communication between the speakers and the audience, which would be a break from the transfer model that Revan and Ellsberg criticise in face-to-face conferences. But is this actually the case? If an online conference is replicating a synchronous traditional conference structure comprised of panels of talks and brief periods of questioning, why would this automatically result in a very different form of unidirectional communication and learning just by virtue of being online rather than in a physical space? I mean, I don't think it would. So what should we do? How might we be able to grasp this moment where we're forced to change the way we conference and create new ways of doing things that are better than what came before, rather than a duplication of old practices? I don't pretend to have all the answers today, but here's a few what-if questions to play with. A few things that I would personally like to try if I had more time or would like to see being tried more by others. Firstly, what if we embrace asynchronous conferencing? What is really being gained from these things being live? We could be interacting asynchronously over a longer period of time around shared objects of study or problems, whatever they might be, pre-recorded videos or written pieces or questions or whatever, developing our ideas in collaboration and discussion at our own convenience. Rather than a conference being a synchronous event where a community of practice might emerge, how about an asynchronous conference as a community of practice, working together on shared questions over a longer period? Secondly, if we are sticking to synchronous conferences for whatever reason, what if we binned the video calls? A year into the pandemic and deep in the midst of Zoom burnout, I'd posit that live video calls are a uniquely exhausting way to spend your time. Bad for your eyesight, bad for your posture. My students have shared with me that they find them bad for their mental health and triggering for their anxiety. And I could go on. I, for one, can't wait until video calls stop being a part of my day-to-day life. The next trend in social media seems to be audio chat rooms, and I take from that a lot of other people feel similarly to me about video calls. There's a new social network called Clubhouse where an organizer can start an audio chat room, choose who is on stage and who is in the audience, then do a live voice-only chat room, kind of like a live podcast, but where it's very easy to interact with the audience and pull them up on stage. Twitter and other sites have already pinched the same functionality. I think it's called Spaces on Twitter. To me, this trend feels like an ideal platform to explore for an audio-only conference. Lastly, what if we unconference? Unconferences, short for unconventional conferences, date back to 1985, and they grew out of the technology industry. And according to Carr in 2016, they are traditionally physical face-to-face conferences. But despite their roots as physical conferences, I think that they may provide a precedent for how participant interaction at online conferences might be managed to encourage a different form of peer learning and collaboration than the old model. Various established formats of sessions on conferences exist to facilitate discussion and collaboration. I don't have time to get into those today, but many of them may lend themselves to existing online social platforms. As unconferences aim to prioritize conversation over presentation, with an agenda set by the participants, less lecture-style presentations, and more emphasis on discussion and cooperative knowledge. As such, they may address some of the common concerns about virtual conferences being less adept at allowing meaningful interactions between participants by making the meaningful interaction between participants the primary activity of the conference. Okay, so I'll conclude here. Here's a bibliography on the screen. My Twitter and LinkedIn details are there as well if you'd like to add me. In conclusion, the COVID-19 pandemic has necessitated a sudden shift across the higher education sector away from the dominant entrenched model of face-to-face conferences. While the current situation has accelerated the shift to virtual conferences, there was a trend before the pandemic and a growing push from many scholars to develop and experiment with new, more sustainable and inclusive models of conferencing. Virtual conferences can address some of the common criticisms of face-to-face conferences, but do also have their own disadvantages and barriers to participation. Furthermore, it is my central argument today that by closely replicating the structures and activities of face-to-face traditional conferences, many online conference organizers aren't fully exploiting the potential for a new form of conference, designed with online platforms in mind and built on collaboration and interaction. As online conferences become more necessary and the means of delivery change, there is a strong case for the structure and style of conferences to be radically reimagined. Thanks for listening. I'm looking forward to hearing the other talks on the panel and then to any questions you might have. Or add me on Twitter and let's keep the conversation going on there. Thank you.